I kind of jump into the middle.
Right. Just like Joe Rogan, bro.
Yeah. Fuck. You're going to be a popular guest because you start off owning me right now. But there's an interesting. We were just talking for people who weren't listening because how could ya? But we were talking about sort of the mad scramble, and this is something we've talked about on the show before. Sort of a mad scramble of people in the modern age to seek truth in the past, and some people are especially idolizing medieval culture, medieval history.
Are you there?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, there you are.
Sorry. Yeah, people are sort of idolizing medieval history. And I think there's an interesting part to that, which is that I think part of it is the intersection of sort of our awareness of medievalness and meme culture. So we had talked about this before where, we kind of make fun of like all the memes that are talking about like Roman motivation about, here's a statue of guy holding snake and it says quit your job or whatever it might be, and then, but it's sort of like this poorly understood idea of what the medieval life actually was, intersecting with meme culture that is very, very sensationalized and very bite-sized. It almost prohibits you from taking in information in a more nuanced way. So in one sense, maybe it's the fact that like the information's good, but the conduit needs work. And then on the other hand, the conduits are good, but what's being plugged into it is usually bad too. So we have a few problems there.
Well, yeah, and I was just saying before we started rolling, something is happening where we're in this cultural crisis, and people are like, all of our worldview is breaking down in the light of everything that's happening, and we're trying to make sense of it. So yeah, people are casting back and having this kind of medieval fetishism and trying to, erase the Enlightenment and all this kind of stuff. But like the kind of meme culture that comes out of it is like, people aren't actually trying to reclaim the medieval life. They're harking back to it and then presenting it in this weird postmodern way. So there's something in there. There's some kind of gas in there, but it's just I don't know. Like, it's easy for it to become a LARP. It's easy for it to be ridiculous. It's easy for it to be just like mega hyper cringe. But I think it's an attempt to kind of break through this cultural wall that we've hit to try to imagine a new way to think or a new way. And I think that's what's lost on people is they're not actually conscious that we are actually trying to do something new. We're not trying to regain the past. We're trying to move forward. But we have this weird thing on the right where it's like, well, that's progressive. That's progressivism. It's like, well, I mean, yeah, it is. But
yeah, because sometimes it just is the language. And I wonder, because I always found that even on the far right, even in the fascist circles, you do have a love of futurism.
Yeah.
So there's almost this obsession with future, fast, go forward. And to the point you had just made, which is very interesting, is that I think a lot of people, they have various fetishizations of the past across the political spectrum, because I think everyone has the same underlying problem, which is, I feel I've been lied to about history. And this is leftist. This is on the right. This is conspiracy theorist. This is maybe various religious denominations. And then I think there's a variety of solutions to address that. So some people just assume then everything's a lie all the time. And then some people will try and dig out the truth and then discover how insanely difficult that is, especially the further you go back and you get into it. We did this on the show when we were discussing, for example, the history of the kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth and other ancient texts. And it's like you're going to have giants, you're going to have dragons. It's as real as anything else. The further you go back, it's like, Merlin was here and he predicted all kinds of stuff according to a lot of the sources. So it gets very difficult the further you go back to get, by modern standards, what we would see as like an accurate portrayal of anything. And so I think one of the biggest sort of crises emerging in this paradigm shift we're in, is people trying to figure out what to do with history. And like you said, I think on the right, there's this love of tradition, which is, I think, is good.
Right. Yes.
And you yourself, as an Orthodox Christian, I know that's probably not lost on you as well. But then we don't know what to do with that. It's like, do we stay locked in there? Do we stay holding that flame, or do we take that flame and carry it somewhere else? And I think that's one of the things we're discussing in our political sphere. What do you think of that, or am I way out to lunch?
Yeah, no, there's something to that. I mean, it's something like, we have to kind of reclaim the wealth or the value or whatever from tradition that's been jettisoned by this kind of hyper liberal postmodern, crazy world that we've stepped into. But we can't do that by just imitating, like, we can't just imitate like 18th century peasants or something, like it's just not going to work. It doesn't jive with the facts of reality in the 21st century. So somehow we have to sort of, and this is like an maybe unsolvable at the moment problem. Like, we have to reclaim the value of those things, but in this kind of new, sci-fi weird world reality that we live in. And I don't know what that looks like, but I think that's really what everybody's doing with like this like weird meme culture going on. It's some kind of attempt to make friends with the weirdness of the postmodern world, but integrate in the solidity and the gravity and the groundedness of traditional values. And it's a weird problem, but I think that's what people are doing, and it's cool.
That's a good point. I think for a lot of people who have a lot of good things to say and a lot of true things to say, I give one example of, the priest at my church. He's, just let people know I'm speaking with an Orthodox Christian. I'm a Catholic myself. We're already spitting distance away from a knife fight. But hopefully, hey, we're bridge builders on blood satellite.
Yes.
But the idea was like he has the same problem that a lot of people have, which is, how do we get young people involved in this? And he's interested in me because I work in marketing and advertising. So, which is a lot of the time just like getting an idea and getting it in the minds of the right audience. And so that's something that I've seen a lot of people struggle with. Like, the information's out there, the wisdom is out there. And I think and this might be, I'm not convinced of this take. I'm maybe 65% convinced of this take, but I'm going to say it and see how it feels. I think we might be getting a bit tired of meme culture, where I think it's mutated to such a degree that the memes have started turning in on themselves and become mutated and strange. And almost like we've already gone past black pilling memes, and now we're on like happily suicidal memes, and it's almost ironic. It's post-ironic.
It's getting weird. Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, we got to liven it up with something, because this used to be fun. No one here's having fun. We're trading images about how we want to die. So there's got to be something else.
Well, my view of that is, I think what's been happening for the last, I don't know, decade, 2 decades, whatever, is we've been in a phase of like university. We've been in an academic phase. We've been in a talk phase. We've been in a debate, metaphysics, political discourse, critique, writing essays, having arguments on Twitter kind of phase. And memes are kind of like the ultimate pure expression of that conversation, because it kind of distills the whole zeitgeist into really simple expressions that kind of hit you with the clarity of like what people are really thinking. But the problem is, at some point you have to go from an academic phase where this is all like university talk and critique into actual art, into like real cultural artifacts being created, real, novels and paintings and artwork and music and all the things that constitute really robust, enlivening, authentic, engaging, nurturing culture that like feeds people's vision and feeds their souls. We don't have that now. We have a lot of podcasts, we have a lot of talk, we have a lot of debate, but we don't have like a great movement of painters and writers that have taken all this vision and all of this idea and presented it in a way that everybody can get and that everybody is sort of nurtured spiritually by. So I think we're in a moment where we kind of have to make that transition. What we need is less talk, and we need to take the zeitgeist of this whole thing and actually make really good cultural, art with it.
I agree with what you're saying, and we've been saying that for a long time, and we've talked to a great many people on the right who are starting now to do that. And I try not to lay too many critiques on anyone who's doing anything good. I don't like to be too critical on things where I think it counts. But if there's one minor criticism I'd give to a lot of the writers, especially, and I say this as a writer myself, and I have a book that's going to be coming up in the next month or so of short stories. But one thing that I found is that even in our writing, our creative writing, there's short stories, long stories, it's very, very dystopian, and people almost they start with as it almost starts as a blog post that they just have characters act out, but there's not that joy of actually telling a story, just like you would see, like, does Banksy paint, like, in a way, but it starts off as a social critique, and then it's displayed in a quirky way, but that doesn't really speak to your soul in any way. It's like the Weird Al Yankovic of art.
Yeah, and it's like tailor made specifically just for like young dissident men with these certain tastes. It's not something that speaks to like the whole culture. It's hard for a lot of people to get on board with something like Thomas 7-7. What's the book he wrote?
Steel Storm.
Like there's a very small audience for that book. Like most 35-year-old housewives are not going to be able to stomach that book. And that's not, like that. It's fine. I'm not saying that like every piece of art has to appeal to literally everybody, but you're going to have to come up with art that speaks to people on some kind of broader scale if there's going to be a real cultural shift.
Yeah. And this is something, to speak to people, you need, I'm going to use writing as an example. And I know you are a musician, so you may have some musically inclined opinions on this, but I know one trick I notice for me that works is you have to start with characters, obviously. And a lot of, and I'm not the best at this, but I know where I can do better. But usually you have to have characters that you care about. And I think a lot of writers don't actually have characters that they care about. So they have these premises, and they have a statement they want to make. And, if I see, again, not trying to criticize too much, but if I see another fucking short story that's set in Why America, like I know nothing cool is going to happen here. I know it's going to be suffering all the way down. And you've probably got characters that you hate, and you have characters you hate that you want to see suffer. And then, when we watch that, we see that in movies all the time. We watch a movie where there's, one movie I watched recently was Glass Onion. And it's like, this is just populated by characters the writer wants to see fail and humiliate. And I'm like, this isn't enjoyable for anyone. So I think if you actually take the time and make a character that you like and want to see things happen to rather than punish, you might have a good story that really sticks with people rather than like another piece of their soul that you ripped out.
Yeah, I think, my general feeling about a lot of those stories and a lot of what's coming out in our circles is that I don't know how to say this except that it's still too political. Like it's still sort of niche designed for our little weird little internet circle with our sensibilities and our memes. And this is a conversation I've seen a lot lately on Twitter. Dave, the Distributors Dave, had like a massive thread about this a couple days ago about, just these ideas of like, is art right wing? Like, how do we make right wing art? Or, at some point, does art transcend the right wing, left wing thing? And I think part of the problem is that our people are still a little too locked into the politics when they're making this stuff. Whereas at some point you have to, and this is what what I was on this rap about universalism. Like there is a sense in which what we're trying to do really, if you're really serious about tradition, okay, and spirituality, what you're really trying to do is really address the human condition at its deepest level. Like that's what we love about traditionally classic works of art, like the Odyssey or whatever, you name it, is that it's not that, what's political about the Odyssey. It's talking about life on its deepest level, and it's not caught up in all this trivial memeish, politics of the moment. And I think that's what we have to have a mind to, but it's very difficult to do that. And it's difficult for us as creators the more we're caught up in this like dissonant right wing online culture. So
Yeah.
Personally, for me, it's like I feel like I have to take a step back from it. And when I'm in a real creative process, writing a song or writing a poem or a story or whatever, when it really gets going, I kind of forget about all this stuff because I'm trying to look at something deeper. And I think what I would say is that the hyper liberal postmodern world has failed to see deeply into the human condition. And that's why we're all engaged in this critique of trying to restore that through traditional values and things. But we have to do it in an artistic way to actually produce the culture that will reawaken something in the society to allow us to move forward.
Yeah, and this is where we get into a topic that people are probably sick of hearing about, but of the concept of hyper reality. That's kind of what we're talking about when we soullessly try to ape and enact out these things that we feel like a connection to, but it's like a cell phone at a Renaissance fair.
Yeah.
I had a joke in mind the other day. I was thinking like, how many of our problems on the distant right would be solved if we just held a Renaissance fair once a year? There's a lot of bad actors that wash right out, and they would just do that. But it's this idea of like, we're trying to enact something that was from the past, but it's sort of soulless, and it's performative and it's soulless. There's a way deeper definition of hyperreality. Like, there's like Marxists listening who are going to be like, I got it right. I know what it is. I'm just saying this is kind of the thrust of what we're talking about. And it really does, like you'd said, I think you need to start from, like you had said, what is it that you actually like? Like if you are on the right, let's say the dissident right broadly, which encompasses a lot of different beliefs. It's like, what about your belief system do you actually like? And some groups can probably answer that easier than others. But there's a lot of people, like they're only here just because they hate gay people. And I'm like, well, you're not going to be able to really create anything with that. Good point. It's got, one example I would give is just to show people like it doesn't need to be sunshine and flowers. One example is like the book Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. So that's a very brutal book. It's a very savage book, but as you read it, you can tell that this is a writer who has a deep knowledge and affection of America, of the American landscape, of American history, the way he describes how they traverse this terrain, and he kind of meditates on these things. And you could look at that book as like, was that written as a right-wing book? Probably not. But does it deal in themes that would be very familiar and palatable to right-wing audiences? I would say yes. And, some people would say, oh, it's more complicated than that. I know, that's kind of the point.
Yeah.
And so that's just one example of people are saying like, he just wants to do like happy stuff. No, I like miserable things just like any self-respecting man. I like weird, dark stuff.
And you could say that about almost any, like really good art from the last forever. I mean, identify anything as a classic and it's like, well, it's hard to suss out the politics of it because it's not explicitly right wing. It's not like, when we write stories and it's all Nazis and it's all like all the motifs of our memes are in there. It's like it's not like that when you read you know War and Peace. It's like it's talking about life. It's like it's gone down a few layers underneath the just the ephemeral politics of the moment, and it's talking about something about the human condition that is beyond time, that doesn't change with the ebb and flow of history. That's why it's a classic. That's why Homer stands up. That's why Shakespeare stands up. And we recognize what the left has abandoned is like the ability to perceive the value in that deep place. But it's like we're trying to reclaim that deep place, but we easily get caught up in just all the ephemeral political stuff of the moment, and we can't get down to like the real deal. So it's hard for us to produce. What we need to produce are like classics. We need like a real artistic movement. And so now, when I see all the bickering on Twitter, I just keep saying, show me the art. Show me the art. Everybody's talking. It's like, show me something that's really going to present these values in a deep way to the culture at large.
That's a great point. And before we move on, I am going to introduce you now. I am speaking here with Anglo Ortho, who's a very, very well known content creator, one that I'm a fan of. You can find him on YouTube. I don't believe you have an Odyssey, correct? It's just on YouTube?
Just YouTube.
Yeah, so go there. He's got some videos on some things I think we're going to talk about today, but he's got quite a few long form videos on some topics mainly relating to. I guess we can get into this now. Sort of your orthodox. You have a very interesting story that I think would be interesting to start with.
You don't know the half of it.
Yeah, so like I'm going to give the very, very brief headline of what I know is that you are Orthodox Christian.
Yeah.
And you're kind of in the sort of distributist sphere of things, and you've been a speaker, a very popular speaker, and made some videos. But you're a former progressive as well, and I remember you were speaking on that. Mm-hmm. And I guess to start, and you could take as many tangents or wander away from this point as much as you want, but what was your story in short going from a progressive, and were you always adjacent to Christianity, or did that come later, or what do you think happened there?
Well, no. I mean, I was raised by an atheist. My father was a hardcore, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins kind of atheist, a man of science. So I was never. I mean, I grew up. I went to a sort of nominally Christian private school, so I was surrounded by Southern Baptist culture, but I never took it seriously. I never thought it had anything to do with me. I thought it was just kind of ridiculous. So Christian adjacent, not really. But in terms of progressivism, I was talking to a friend of mine a few days ago who's similarly he's my age. We're both, pushing 40 now. And we were both, sort of automatically left leaning back in the, when we were young in the early 2000s. And we were talking about how, and we both come out of it. And I was saying, even when I was 21, 22, or, when Obama came along or whatever was going on with the left, I always I never really was all the way into it because I was raised in a fairly conservative environment. I mean, my father, he wasn't like a Christian or anything, but he was very conservative in his views of life in terms of just basic, like taking responsibility for your actions. He was very much against, welfare and this kind of stuff, and working hard, and he had those values. And I grew up in rural West Georgia, which is very conservative. So I think even when I was like an urbane young person, I could just never really get all the way on board with the progressivist thing. I always kind of felt there was something wrong with it. And then once once the Obama presidency started and rolled on for a few years, I started having more and more like, what are we doing? Especially when like gender theory and Black Lives Matter and all that stuff started up. I was like, this has nothing to do with what I believe in. I was a progressive just because I was young and I'm temperamentally a creative person, an intellectual person. So it was just automatic in the late 90s, early 2000s that meant you were a liberal, because the Republicans, those are the stupid, the uneducated, uncultured, stick in the mud type people. But no, I'm a forward thinking creative person, so I'm on the left. But when the reality of that started showing its ugly face, especially as the Obama years went on, I was more and more, you know, disenchanted with it. And then I went through, like one does, personal crises and things like that made me really question the liberal project as a whole. And then I started this whole, you know, Thomas Sowell to Hitler Curious pipeline thing that we've all done,
Well, I just wanted to mention quickly the Obama phenomenon. I think is
Mm,
I hear that a lot from people, and one example I would give is I think we're probably in the same age bracket. I'm in my mid 30s, and so I think we
yeah.
went through a lot of the same epochs where we had the same sort of visceral memories because they're fitted to your age at the time. So going through Obama in like your 20s versus like when you're like a young teenager or you were old is probably different. But like the Obama thing, I think woke a lot of people up in strange ways. Even if you're not a racist and you hate him just because he was black. But one thing I noticed was for me, like I was always into metal and punk rock and things like
Mhm.
that, and I believe that there was this thing called a counterculture, and that counterculture had value because it was always keeping the power in check. And the
Yeah.
punk rockers were always talking shit about authority. And even
Yeah.
though it seemed kind of childish, I'm like, that's kind of fun, always having this permanent check and balance. But then I noticed when Obama took office, all the punk rockers shut up and all of the dissidents shut up. And I said, this is a strange thing I'm living through right
Yeah.
now. And that threw everything else. I'm like, oh, so this is all bullshit. That was like one thing, one of many, but I noticed that, oh, like how everything moves in lockstep, even the rebels. That was really jarring
Hmm.
for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Sorry to cut you off there. I
no,
wanted
I
to hear more of
remember
your
that
story.
same kind of thing, and I really, when Obama was elected, that's when it started for me. I was like, because I was, I'm 39, so I don't know, I guess I was 19 or 20 when the Iraq War started up, and everybody hated Bush and Halliburton, and all that was going on, and so I think the first election I voted in was I voted for John Kerry in 2004. But at that time, it was like, well, George Bush is terrible, and all this corruption's going on, and all these lies are being told. So, and that was in the day of like the Daily Show and the Colbert Report, where it just was like, oh, we're the enlightened people. We're not these stupid Republicans who want to bomb other countries, and they wear tacky suits, and they have no culture, and we're the creative artistic people, and we're smart because we understand Jon Stewart's jokes and all this kind of self-righteous attitude. But as soon as Obama came along, I think I started to see that self-righteous aspect of it, maybe dimly at first, but then year after year after year, and me becoming older and getting married and having kids, and seeing the reality of life in that way, I started to kind of snap out of it a little bit.
I was wondering if, and so when did your faith and your Christianity enter into that? Again, you went to that church. Did it kind of increase in volume over time? Would you say?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, because I was a sort of avowed perennialist when I was in my 20s. Um, so, my attitude was that, there's a spiritual reality, there's a transcendent spiritual reality. The soul persists after death, but humans are incapable of imaging that reality fully. So all these religions are, you know, incomplete attempts to do that. You know, like just Joseph Campbell type, you know, perennialism. And so
Yeah,
I
like the monomyth and things like that, right?
exactly, yeah. So I studied Buddhism and I read the Vedas and I was into this and I was into that. And even in those days, I think unlike a lot of those perennialists, I was into Christianity because I read, I guess I read the Gospel of Mark when I was, I don't know, 25 or 26, sort of from that lens. And I was like, oh, this is, you know, there's something going on here that all of the other perennialist, spiritual, but not religious people seem to ignore. It's like a joke now that all the perennialists, like, they're like, oh, we're into every religion except Christianity. Christianity, that's totally taboo. But I wasn't like I was sort of drawn to it and fascinated by Christ, but in no way would I ever have thought about, you know, participating in any specific institution or ideology. So, and that lasted a while. And I mean, really, in my heart of hearts, there's still, you know, I still am that way to some degree. But I think at some point, well, like, you know, a lot of it had to do with, like I said, going through personal trials and, you know, just intense life disrupting crises to realize, you know, just how screwed up my worldview was
Were
and
there any of
how,
those crises that you'd be willing to disclose to give context for people?
well, let's see. When my father passed away, um, this was 2015. Because I had, you know, like I said, he was very sort of conservative in his worldview, and I had become very liberal in my worldview. And my life really was pretty much a disaster by the time I was 30. Um, and I was estranged from my father for a few years. Really, just 'cause I couldn't handle, I couldn't tolerate our relationship. But things in my life got so bad and so rock bottom that at some point I kind of snapped out of it and I realized, uh, oh, like my dad was right. I should have listened to him all this time and I wouldn't have made all these mistakes. And so
I was going to ask
I,
you about that because, like, do you feel like you've become more like your father as you get older? Because I feel
oh
that
yeah,
very much as I get older,
well,
especially. Yeah.
it started at that point because I hadn't spoken to him in like 2 years. Um, and when I started really snapping out of it and realizing how wrong I had been, I was like, oh shit, you know, I've got to make things right with my dad. So I reached out to him and I reconciled with him, and it was like a really beautiful thing. And it was like a prodigal son type of thing, you know, because I didn't know if he would even, you know, talk to me, but of course he did because fathers love their children. Um, and then I realized what a dick I had been all those years, and so I apologized, and I wrote him this long letter about how, you know, I wanted him to be part of my life and my kid's life and all this stuff and blah blah blah. And so we reconciled, and it was this great thing. And then it must have been, I don't know, 2 weeks after this, he passed away totally unexpectedly, massive heart attack out of nowhere. So then I went through this whole thing of like, you know, I had to go through the grief of losing my father after this really intense estrangement and reconciliation, and it just completely uprooted my entire worldview. You know, it was almost like starting over, and there was a lot of other problems going on in my life at the time. So that was, you know, and that was, you know, that was right when the Trump thing was starting up and the political situation was going crazy. And So in the process of, then I had to go home and go through all my dad's stuff, and and it was like reconnecting with him and his more traditional, more conservative worldview that I had to take back on board, and then that just went right into all the political stuff that happened 2016, 17, whatever, going forward. So yeah, for sure, I become more like my dad as
Yeah,
I get older, especially after that.
and that's a dimension to things that I think some people ignore. Sometimes we get wrapped up in the psychological, sort of the universalist psychological aspect of things, but then we
Mm,
forget that a lot of times our politics are deeply personal. Not only are they
yeah.
tied to the regions we grow up in, especially if you're like a nationalist type,
Hmm.
but then also your family. Like my father, he passed away when I was very, very young, when I was a teenager, and so I missed out on a lot of that stuff. But when he was a conservative guy, and so, but he was a conservative in an era where being conservative was different. And
Yeah.
as you get older, you go usually when you're young. I guess you go through a rebellious phase. I'm not. I'll tell you what. Some people say that they're like, "Oh, everyone rebels when they're young." I do think that might be a symptom of modernity. I'm not sure. I just have a gut feeling that if you go back a few hundred years, you might not have seen as many kids doing the 180-degree opposite of what their parents
Yeah.
did as like a
Yeah.
rite of passage.
Hmm.
But I do wonder now and again, like he didn't live to see it, but I'm like, I wonder if he would have been a Trump guy. Because I remember, like
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I'm going to say this. People, I've never said this on the show. I think people are going to laugh about this, but because I have a podcast, and he was really, really big into talk radio, and something that
Yeah.
he used to do was
Yeah.
call in to like the conservative talk radio
Oh, like
shows.
Rush Limbaugh, he would.
Yeah, yeah, and he would
Yeah.
become like a guy who would be put on the air.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah.
geez,
Yeah.
I realized that recently. Like, oh my god, I'm doing the bit,
Yep.
and he would say
Yep.
things offhand that I didn't understand. Like he would call people pinko commie liberals, and I didn't realize what a genius move that was until I'm an
Yep.
adult. I'm like, that was
Yep.
so cool. He might have been further off into the trenches than me. I don't
Yeah.
know. Like he
It
might have.
sounds like, yeah.
We're in Canada. He might have flown down on January 6th. Like, that would have been
Uh-huh. Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah. 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 See, my dad was like, he was very sort of conservative in his foundations, but he was more liberal than the community because we lived in like really deep South, rural West Georgia, basically, like 5 miles from the Alabama state line, country, deeply Southern Baptist, as conservative as you get. But my parents they weren't natives. My mother was born in California, my father was born in Ohio. They had lived all over the country, and they were very highly educated and and much more, I would say, I don't know, culturally sophisticated than like most of the people in our community. So I would have, in a sense, it's relative. Like I would have seen my parents as being more liberal, but in the context of like today's politics, I can see that. Yeah, they were actually really conservative. It's just that they had this cultural sensibility. They had an awareness of the world beyond Carrollton, Georgia, and they had this artistic inclinations and intellectual occupations. So I think that's why I kind of set myself up as more leftward leaning, when I started my own life. It's just that looking back, it's like, oh no, they were very traditional. They were very, they would have opposed all of the insanity happening now. I don't know. I think about what my dad would have done with Trump, because he passed away in 2015, right before that happened. And I don't know, man. I just don't know. Because he was more, I'd say, libertarian, than our people.
Yeah. Well, there's this comedian I really like named Shane Gillis. And one of
Mm.
his bits on his latest special
Oh,
was
you there? Oh,
oh,
sorry.
can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
back.
One of my favorite comedians is his name's Shane Gillis, and he has a bit on his last special where he describes his dad turning into a Trump guy who's always a conservative guy.
Yeah.
You know, when Trump first announces, he's the guy in his recliners saying, "Get this clown out of here." Then after that first debate, you know, everything changes.
Yeah.
Everyone forgets after that first Trump debate,
Yeah.
like hundreds to 150 Americans changed their mind.
Yeah.
So I'm like that. I'd love to see that. See, going back just to see that would be worth it. All these like conservative, and then watching other conservative politicians have to do it too.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry. I don't like reminiscing about Trump, but that was like the coolest shit. If you were
I
paying
know.
attention at that time, we're not going to get that again.
I mean, don't you miss those days? I miss that so much now.
I always explain it to people because in the wake of Trump, there was a lot of theories about what had happened. You know, I know the Joe Rogans of the world. They're like, "Well, Hillary was just a bad candidate." And I'm like, "Well, you know,
Yeah.
really, people overthink it. Why was Trump so popular? Because he's not a really cool guy. He's a really goofy guy.
Yeah.
But they liked what he had to say. They liked what he had to say, even if he said it in a dumb, crazy way. That's really all it
Yeah.
was. Like
Yeah.
zero other politicians were saying we have a problem at the border and we need to take
Right.
that problem seriously. And it turns out if you do that, everyone gets on board. Now, what they learned from that is that, oh, you can just say that to get votes and then not do it, which is kind of what we're seeing now.
Yeah.
And then also, it was exciting. He kind of made it fun and exciting, and what it meant for people like us. Because I remember walking into work the day after Trump was elected. I'm in Canada, like and I was living in Toronto, Canada, which is very densely urban area, and I'm like. The sun was shining only for me that day. I walked in whistling a tune. I had a spring in my step.
I felt the same way.
There were ladies crying when I got to work. It was the strangest thing. It's like it's like you saw 25 people be assassinated was the vibe I was getting. But what it made us feel, and I think this is what people really want to recapture. I think it was the last time that people of our general political persuasion felt that we could move the needle on politics.
Yes, there was so much hope. There was like, I just felt all this positive sense, this energy and this forward movement. And it felt like that for a while. You know, it really sustained and it felt so hopeful and optimistic.
Anything was possible. And I think I'm still trying to chase that dragon of
well,
feeling like
in a
anything's
sense,
possible.
I mean, the election of Trump almost does kind of suggest that anything is possible. I mean, the fact that he got in there, it really should not have happened.
You know? That's what I was going to say next. I think a lot of people, if you really are honest with yourself and you're really paying attention at the time, I know this is what I felt, that I thought Trump was very, very popular, but I'm like, there's something in me screaming that, you know what? He's not going to win. Something's going to happen. Something magic is going to happen. There's no way the system will let this happen. And so when I woke up the next day and it worked, you're like, what? I was wrong. So because a lot of cynical people became uncynical. And I thought there was such a magic to that. And maybe that was, some people will say that's too naive and stuff. I'm like, I don't know, man. Like there was a lot of, I'd like to harness that energy again, because I think it proved that we can do something, and maybe not that, but something else,
Yeah. I mean, to me, it speaks of, this fact that, no matter what the situation looks like, there is this weird edge of reality. There's this weird thing in play all the time. And this is almost, I mean, this almost strikes me as a kind of a more liberal friendly idea, that there is this kind of strangeness to reality where crazy shit can happen, like Trump getting in there, that, there's this weird free play to the world. Things are not lock set in stone. So it's kind of, I feel like it's a contradiction for us because we lean toward order and stability and, hard lines and definitions, et cetera, et cetera. But in this weird way, things like the election of Trump are a reminder that there's this weirdness to reality always that allows for new things to happen, novel things and creative things. And I think there's like a sense of that nature of life in reality that the left has tried to own, that we need to like take back from them. If that
Yeah.
makes any sense.
No, I agree completely. But before I go on, I want to give a prediction for people. Something
Okay.
just occurred to me for the next. Sometimes we call things like Trump getting elected. Maybe we could even call that a black swan event, where
Sure.
it really came out of no one saw it coming. Maybe that's bending the definition a little. But I was trying to think of what would be something Trump-like that could happen in the future that we could really be blindsided by. And I got one, and I don't know when this will happen, but maybe the next 10 years. I think within our lifetime, we'll see the first openly organized crime affiliated person get elected to something at the lowest level, governor. Now, the reason I say that
Interesting.
is
Okay.
because I'm anticipating. I was listening to Peter Zihan the other day, and he was talking about how the cartels the Mexican drug cartels are a bigger problem in America than anyone wants to admit, and that they've won several gang wars that no one really knows about. But I think you're going to start to see the cartels flex, and they're in a power play that is far beyond what most organized crime is doing. So I think you'll start to see in the South. Maybe you'll see a governor who everyone knows is like a brother of like a cartel guy, and then that's going to be the new thing. The new thing is going to be crime bosses running, and everyone's cool with it. I
I
think
mean,
that happens.
that doesn't sound far-fetched to me. That seems completely plausible.
And that'll be like, okay, we're going to run our crime guys. We're going to run our kingpins. Like what? Because everyone will joke like, oh, Kennedy had his dealings and people had their dealings. But I'm going to be like, no, we're going to have a guy like waving the Sinaloa cartel flag or some shit. And then that'll just be a cool thing that happens now. You're going to be running
like
Aryan
fun.
Brotherhood. You're going to be running Crips. You're going to be running everybody. Now, if you ever want to take this bit and run with it, Obama Crip that actually sounds like a Chappelle Show bit. I might have just described a Chappelle Show bit. So maybe this isn't a new idea. And just back to the main topic, just to kind of tie back to that, I found something interesting that you had a video recently available on your YouTube where you're discussing liberalism. Now, it was very interesting, and maybe we'll get into kind of the meat of it here, because you had this one video called "Particularism." Particularism is liberal and cringe.
Oh yeah,
and that's a fiery video, and that's what people sent me first, and they really wanted you on because this comes across my desk. This guy's all fire and brimstone, but it's a very it's a good video, and it's putting coming out with the knives. And it was responding, I believe, to Mike from Imperium Press, who's a friend of the show.
Yeah.
But you'd also had another video addressing academic agent. And for me, it's nostalgic because it takes me back to when people on YouTube were just doing response videos to each other. So I just like that.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if you were willing to, take as long as you like, but maybe give a brief overview of what that was, because this is a topic we talked about on the show before, the conflict between universal ideas versus particular ideas. So I'll let you go if you have anything to say.
And hopefully you can refresh me on some of the nuances of that discussion, because I feel like there was a lot of good points in there and I'm going to forget them. But in general, it's kind of like a false dichotomy, really, like universalism versus particularism, which I said in the video. It's like, well, in reality, it's like, you have a set of universals, and then as you scale down to the particular moment in time, things particularize and become differentiated. And there's this sort of chain that connects them. So it's not, universalism versus particularism seems a little bit like a false dichotomy, but academic agent was, I think in that video, he was sort of making a defense of particularism and realism as opposed to idealism, which again, I think these are false dichotomies, but uh, because they're false dichotomies, you can't just divorce them. You can't divorce the universal out of your worldview, because then you can't make any claims about anything. Everything becomes just a kind of relativistic chaos. And this is something that people on the right should understand. After all this critique of the left and postmodernism that's gone on for the last 10 years. But this happens all the time, I mean, Carl Benjamin does this all the time. Sargon, he's always making claims, but he's unwilling to kind of tie them down to any kind of actual metaphysic or actual, I don't know, religious claim or whatever. He doesn't want to dirty his hands with that, but he's making claims about virtue and goodness and this and that. It's like, well, you can't have it both ways. I mean, you're either going to have recourse to some kind of universal claim about metaphysics, or you're going to just find yourself in this kind of chaos of incidental postmodernism, which one do you want to do? Because you can have your pick, but you can't really have it both ways.
Yeah.
And I feel like you're just going to end up. My question to the academic agents of the world is like, well, then why do you, like, if everything is just about this kind of nitty gritty realpolitik realism with no metaphysical underpinning, and if there's no universalist claims you're trying to make, why do you object to the current power structure? They attained power. They're good at keeping it. They're, why do you should be on their side?
That's an interesting point, because one thing we had remarked on in the past is that this is unfortunately, I guess, the pothole some people get stuck in when they get really into elite theory, which is completely valid. We've covered elite theory on the show before, and we're great admirers of a lot of the work, but you end up almost worshiping elite as such, like this free floating concept of elites. Like, this is how they act. If you want to be an elite, you should adopt these characteristics. Very almost motivational speaker like. And then if you just like power, then you almost have to assume that whoever has power deserves power.
Yes,
why are we
exactly.
against them?
Right. Why are you critiquing the World Economic Forum? They have power and they're good at keeping it. So you should be in support of them, if that's your worldview.
Yeah. And, and you were responding to an academic agent, I believe, in a couple of videos. An academic agent, for the listeners who don't know, is a very, very popular content creator, and we wish him well. But there's a couple things I know, and I'm nothing against academic agent, but I know there's a couple things he's kind of known for. To me, one is making up new terms for things that don't fucking need new terms made up for them. The second is kind of accusing a lot of people of being secretly liberal, which I think he was doing to you as well at one point.
Yep.
Which I think is you were trying to do like a little twist there by saying that he was doing like a liberal thing. But
let me just say really quick, I find it obnoxious when people use these tactics in debate where, like academic agent loves to call people liberal, but it's like, well, if you want to break down academic agent's rhetoric, he relies on statistics. He relies on a kind of reign of quantity analysis of human behavior. Liberalism is baked into his worldview, as it is for all of us. So you can't just say, oh, well, you're liberal, so you're wrong. It's like, well, we all have this load. We're all laden with this liberal thinking. It's not really good faith argument to like just call someone a liberal.
Yeah, and this, some people will hear that and they'll balk at that, but this is something that I've been getting into a bit more nuanced way lately. And I always give the example of psychology. Now, so a lot of, and it's in the large discussion of what about liberalism is escapable and which is inescapable, and which is actually in our DNA as, broadly European individuals. But the idea is that, let's use psychology as an example. Most people hate psychology. They don't like psychologists. They don't like psychiatrists. There's a whole mountain of complaints we might have about what psychology has birthed. However, even as we critique psychology and psychiatry, we still accept this idea of the unconscious. We still accept a lot of what, a lot of individuals don't know, but this stuff was birthed from the psychological movement. Our awareness of how the mind works, the entire idea of, mental trauma came out of this in the 20th century and the late 19th century. Conceptualization, like the entirety of your childhood development being of critical importance, was like a new idea. So I'm
Yeah.
like, we can't really, like, how much of our critique of psychology must we also use psychology itself within the
Right.
critique? In that sense,
Right.
like, ironically, when we critique liberalism, can we really escape out of the liberal mindset? Because the entire concept of being a dissident standing against the system
Yes.
is almost
Yes.
itself a liberal idea.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. Well, no, you can't get out of it. Just like you can't get out of, you know, I mean, my objection to, like I mentioned Carl Benjamin, or Academic Agent does this too. My objection to those guys, the claims they're trying to make claims without any recourse to any kind of religious, metaphysical claim or spiritual grounding. And it's like, but they're still, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to make a transcendentalist, like what am I trying to say? Uh, I'm trying to make like, you can't make those claims without some kind of resource to typically religious based notions of what goodness is or what virtue is. So they're taking this kind of uh, habitual leftover from Christian culture and using it, but they don't want to give any credit to that. They just want to use it because, oh, well, we all understand what virtue is. So we all understand what goodness is. Well, we don't, though. It's not, you can't just say that. You can't escape from the need to tie this down to some kind of metaphysical claim. So, in the same way that you can't escape those things in order to make the case for traditionalism, you also can't escape the liberal, you can't escape the heritage of liberalism that we inherit from the last several centuries. And I would say, and this is what I'm trying to make the case for to people, you not only can you not escape it, but you don't need to. Like, this is part of who we are. It's like it's part of this whole organic chain of culture that we've grown out of. And you can't just say, it's like we're on a train on a track. We can't just be like, well, let's take the last 200 years of track and just get rid of it. It's like, no, that track is there for a reason. Freud and Jung and whatever you want to reference from the 19th, 20th century, all of it is there as part of this development. And you can't just get rid of it. It's just, we can critique it and recognize its problems, but we have to move forward. We can't just go back to, the 1600s
Yeah.
and like none of that ever happened, because we actually got things of value out of it. And this is where people come down on me, is I will make the case that, like, no, we got value out of the Enlightenment and liberalism and technology and 19th century romanticism and 20th century this that, and the moon landing and all of it. Like, we are in 2023, we have come this far, and we must go forward and not just reject our inheritance like a bunch of angry liberal teenagers who are rejecting what their parents bequeathed to them. Like, we have to understand the value of all of this that we've inherited it and bring it forward.
One good example of that would be the gender debate, as we know it in these times, where
Mm-hmm.
I think some people think that sort of scientific rationalism, which has a lot of faults and can be, we've critiqued that in the past, but also, like, they think that, oh, scientific progress means that we're breaking down the walls of genders. Not necessarily. I mean, you
Yeah,
can use that very same science to reaffirm
sure.
traditionalism.
Yeah.
Our insight into DNA has, in a way that I don't think they're expecting, almost reaffirm the strength of ethnicity and whatnot
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of ways. So it's like, yeah, you can use the science to actually double down on certain traditional things.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, but it's like, it's up to us to decide. But I don't accept the premise that everything after like 1600 was bad,
Yeah.
and also, even if we want to say it was, let's hypothetically say it was that, from a biological point of view, I don't think we can really regress. And I mean this in a very physical sense. I mean this in a neurological sense. I think our brains have, and this will sound like a dumb way of saying it, but I think our brains have actually changed their form and evolved in certain ways. Certain sensitivities have been heightened for better or worse. The succeeding generations from now are going to be raised with smartphones, and that's going to fuck up their brains in a way where they won't know how to live like a 1700s person.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think the same thing is true culturally. Like, you're not gonna, we, in our weird little internet dissident sphere, we can play this game, but you're never gonna get a critical mass of humanity in the country or on the planet to go along with the program if you're going to tell them, well, you're going to have to delete the files from the last 300 years, and then we're all going to go forward into this new thing. Like, that's never going to happen. You're never going to get rid of this stuff. You have to move forward, because people just aren't going to delete everything that's happened for the last 300 years.
Yeah, we don't know how to do the old stuff right. Like, does anyone here know how to be a benevolent feudal lord? It's probably really hard. The best we got is shitty landlords. We got to relearn a lot of old stuff. If we started now, it would be a fucking nightmare.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody really wants to do that. See, I don't really think anybody actually wants to go back. They're trying to recapture certain values of the past, but bring them forward into this weird, science fiction world we live in now. And it's a question of like we have to deal with reality, okay? Which is, to me, is a very based traditionalist right-wing attitude. Like, we have to deal with the facts of reality. And, one of the facts of reality that constitutes our life right now in 2023 is that we are an interplanetary species. So you're not going to go back to the 15th century, because that world and that worldview and that social structure is not going to jive with the reality of being an interplanetary species. But we have to somehow, get a hold of those values and how they apply to the human condition, and bring them into this reality of, it's like when we go to Mars. Are we going to Mars as like crazy blue-haired postmodernists, or are we going to Mars as like, people who understand, the need for, strong men and da 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 da. But either way, we're going to Mars. You're not going to be landlocked in some peasant farm in Norway.
Yeah, and you know what was funny? Now that you mention it, we've remarked on this before, but it seems like the only people who are excited about space are far right guys. You're not going to find any leftists. Most liberals don't want to do it, but they have nothing but critiques for people who want to go to space. Of the people who are excited about the prospect of colonizing Mars, it's only like far right guys who lift and eat liver all day. Try getting like a Guatemalan interest in this. No, it's like these guys who just want to like fight aliens right now. So like, we're gonna be the ones anyway.
What's more based in trad than conquering new horizons? So like, why? Like, what's like masculine and trad about wanting to regress 500 years? There's nothing cool about that. All the testosterone points to the horizon. So we're going to Mars. The question is, what kind of culture? Are we going to be listening to Taylor Swift on our way to Mars, or are we going to have some kind of new, genuine, authentic, deep, nourishing music and art and movies to be the soundtrack to our ride to Mars?
Well, I can answer your question, and I think listeners of the show will know what the answer is. I know what music we're going to be listening to. We are going to be listening to Radiohead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yes.
I got one. I got one on the show, guys. How about you go fuck off? We got it. It's a Radiohead show now.
Yeah.
I tried to bring this up with Millennial Woes. He mogged me. Did not want to go down that path. It's been a long time
anybody
coming.
Anybody who's not on board with Radiohead, I'm sorry, man, but you're not on board. Like, you're gonna get left behind.
This is a great episode. I'm having. There's a lot of wisdom being dropped right here. I think a lot of people would
Yes.
be wise and get wise while you're at it.
Yes.
Um, so, and for people just on the universalism versus particularism thing, that was for people who might be a bit confused. My understanding of it is, in short, we talk about this on the show a lot. It's like when you're looking at the world, when you're looking at the laws that govern the world, there's some people who have an understanding of certain, like when we hear about human rights, inalienable human rights, there's things that apply to every human on Earth. And then that comes out of liberalism in a lot of ways. That there's certain, and you'll hear liberals say this all the time,
Right.
like everyone's kind of the
Hmm.
same once you strip away all the culture. While particularism is, I think, a bit more popular on the right, and there's always a struggle between these two. Like we know there's certain realities, there's certain things we can see and test. Do these apply to all humans or just humans in one particular region or a space and a time? And that's kind of the debate. And a lot of people on the right will say that I don't even think you would call it relative. Some people call this relativism. I'm not sure that'd be the right term, but it kind of is that, every race, every ethnicity, every whatever has their own truth and things like that, which also kind of came out of liberalism in a way. But just is that a fair assessment? And also what you were saying before of if we talk about things like virtue and inherent goodness, we kind of are dabbling in universalism. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, again, I think it's a false dichotomy, and this is why this is where the problem comes up in trying to talk about these things, because you know, in a sense, of course, every group has its own proclivities and its own, you know, its own style or whatever. But it's like I said, there's a universal human nature, but as you focus in on the particular situation of a certain time, a certain place, a certain people, a certain culture, that the particularities mount up and they express themselves until it's hard to see what is similar about some an Anglo Canadian in 2023 and an Ottoman sheik in the 18th century or something. But it's like both are true and both have to be incorporated. And I think the problem on the right is that people only want to look at the particularism and say like, well, we're not like those brown people. And the problem on the left is they only want to look at the universalism. It's like, well, we're all one people, one family, one love, one harmony. When really it's just these things are they're not these things work in relation. The universal human nature is expressed in different ways at different times, and it ebbs and flows and mutates and alters over time, so that you know an Anglo American in 2023 is probably going to have a hard time relating to an Anglo 13th century peasant person. So it's just not that simple of particularism versus universalism. Both of these things are happening, but the things that are important tend toward the universal. Like you we probably have very little in common genetically or culturally with Homer, but we can we read the Odyssey and we get really deep insights into the human condition. The same is true with the Old Testament. Like you probably have very little in common genetically and culturally with the people that produced the Old Testament, but it contains fundamental truths about human nature that apply to us. And this is true of great works of art and great works of culture. Now, of course, there's a scale. So some things are more universal in their appeal and some things are more particular. But I think appealing to the particular is a very liberal way of producing art and culture. And appealing to the universal is a very traditional, classic, based way of producing art.
It's an interesting comparison to this, and I'm losing confidence in this comparison as I'm coming up with it, but I think it's relevant. It's almost like the difference between Newtonian physics and Einsteinian physics,
Okay,
where
all right.
we have, both of these physics make sense at their scale. Like they're both true. But
Right.
once you change the scale, one doesn't work and the other kind of works. But they're both real at the same time. And what the world of scientists and physicists are trying to reconcile those two things. In a lot of ways, I see us engaged in the same project. Like we have in this conflict between, like you said, it's kind of a false dichotomy, but we understand that there has to be these universal things. I love the example you had picked of virtue, because
Yeah.
in our scene, I've spoken with a lot of guys like this, and I do believe they believe what they're saying when they say, you know what, I'm apolitical. I'm just about virtue. I'm a virtue guy, and I promise I'm not playing the hatchling when I ask this, but I'm like, I don't know what that means. I don't
Yeah.
know if
Yeah.
like
No.
I'm sweeping the way clean. I'm just virtue and strength
Yeah.
and honor. That's my thing. And I'm like, what does that
Right.
mean? Like in the
Right.
context of what? And if we are
Right.
talking about virtue as this almost a priori ontological thing, like describe that to me. You know what I mean? And so
Hmm.
that's kind of the interplay. It's like we understand, we know virtue in very particular ways contextually, but maybe there's a way to elevate that to something, metaphysical. But how do you do that? You know what I mean? And we're trying to we're always engaged in projects of figuring out what we can elect from the particular to the universal. And we are in a scene that loves talking about the cycles of empires and the fourth
Yeah.
turnings and things like
Yeah.
that. So we're always trying to come up with new things, new particulars we think are universal. As a bit of a ramble there, but I do, it's a similar project, I think, where, like you said, it's that this project that we're engaged in all the time means that it can't be either or, right? That wouldn't make any sense.
Sure. And I would just say that if you're, if you're a trad type person, think about the great works of art that you love and compare them to the culture that you hate. And ask yourself which one leans towards the universal and which one leans toward the particular. Because, like think about hip hop. Hip hop, like 90s era hip hop, it's like at its best, it can get to some sort of truths about human life and human nature, but it's mostly very specifically about, you know, urban Black American life in this certain setting, in a certain economic bracket, with certain rules and certain cultural expressions. And, it's very, very particular. Now compare that with like Shakespeare. There's people in China studying Shakespeare. There's people all over the world have been imbibing and valuing and loving Shakespeare for 500 years because it's speaking very deeply to the human condition. Now, there might be an impoverished minority character in Shakespeare, but it's incidental. It's that's not the point. It's there because you have to choose particulars in order to tell a story. But the story is speaking very deeply to the human condition, as opposed to Taylor Swift or something that is, very much aimed at a very specific little corner of history and culture.
Yeah.
So that's, that I just think artistically, aesthetically, I want people to think about that because, again, I think what we have to do is maybe stop talking so much and stop critiquing so much and start actually really making things and trying to speak to the culture at large in a way that is actually effective.
Yeah, I've never heard it summarized like that, but I think that's a very profound bow you put on it just there, because I've
Mm,
never heard art incorporated into almost describing the effectiveness of our beliefs or our values, in a sense. Like,
mm,
can you take these things that are important and put it in such a way that it lasts forever and it is universalizing it, because it seems that we're always concerned about making things that are eternal. We're making things
Yeah.
that last a long time. It's like, I love the Taylor Swift example. Just for people who don't know, Taylor Swift is usually designed for terminally single women. And
Yeah.
I've known these women in my life. I work with them at my office job, and they're single women who desperately want to find a boyfriend, but they make the cardinal mistake of only listening to other single women.
Yeah.
It never occurred. This blows my fucking mind. It never occurred to a lot of these single women to just listen to a married woman.
Yeah, I know.
And I almost like wanted to grab her and shake her. I'm like, you are like getting close to 30, and I know you
No, yeah.
heard somewhere that you can freeze your eggs. You can't, by the way.
Yeah.
Forget it. But I'm like, listen to a happy woman for once in your fucking life.
They can't do it. They can't do it. The female stubbornness is too deep,
And
the
there's I almost like
competitiveness.
I always
Too
felt bad
deep.
for like a lot of the women in our scene who have podcasts and who have things to say. And I was wondering, it's
Mhm.
like women's sports. I'm like, I don't know why more women don't listen to you. Like, you're married and you got a house and 2 kids and you
Yeah,
got some cool. You're funny.
I
They
know.
talk
Makes
about
sense.
crystals and stuff. I don't really know about that, but the girl stuff, whatever. It's not for me, right? But I'm like, there's
Yeah.
no. What are women listening to? Like suicide, like black makeup girls. Anyway,
Mm.
but just back to the profoundness of what you said. I think that I think makes art relevant to people as almost a way, not using art just as propaganda, which we're very, very good at. We're great at making
Yeah.
propaganda, especially ineffective propaganda. We're great at making
Yeah.
propaganda that looks like it was from 1945. We're good.
Right.
We got that locked up. We got like paleo futurism locked
Yeah.
in,
Yeah.
guys. But like, use art as almost a way to test the universality of your beliefs, if they are truly universal, like the people who are out there saying, I'm about strength and virtue. It's like, well, can you tell a story that really enlightens and illuminates and invigorates people? And I think if you can't do that, maybe we don't have these as powerful ideas as we think they are.
Well, I think we're in danger. I think we've reached a point where we're in danger of sort of getting so trapped in our rhetorical, it's like a snake eating its tail or something. Like we keep having the same conversations over and over and over again. And at some point, it's like this either has to translate into real culture that can speak to people, or we are doomed to just be like internet nerds, who like just go off into some insanity that is completely irrelevant to the project of the world, which actually matters. So I just think, it's I just feel like there's a shift happening where we have to get out of that just purely critical, rhetorical, intellectual mode and just encourage people, like, make stuff, like really, and take it seriously. And you kind of have to come out of the politics a little bit to do it, to really speak deeply to the human condition, or else you're only going to be making stuff that's marketable for young dissident right-wing men,
Yeah.
basically.
And I'm going to throw out a spicy take here. And you don't need to agree with it, but I do think it is true that perhaps the last time we had something from the right that crossed those borders and had that staying power was probably Nazi stuff. And I only say this because it's still around. And if you go, there's Japanese people who look at like old Nazi stuff and think that's really cool. Like, there's something about like the design, the aesthetic, the even people who they know they're not supposed to like it, but they still think it's cool. And when that guy shows up in a movie, he steals the scene. Like, there's something, even though it's bad, you're not supposed to like it, but I'm like, it seemed to have captured something in the zeitgeist that people,
Yeah.
it fired people up in a way that I don't think anything has really fired them up since. And maybe there's like design people like, oh, it's Hugo Boss. Like, it's a lot of things that kind of coalesce together. But that kind of political movement had it was whatever you think about it, it was firing on all cylinders, and people still
Well,
go back to it.
in terms of the expressly political, yeah. But thinking more generally, I mean, you could make a case for you know, 20th century, late 20th century popular art and music, like I'm trying to think of a good example, like Kubrick, you know, is it explicitly left wing? You know, I mean, maybe you could make that analysis, but like, you know, a lot of it speaks a little more deeply than. Oh, let me pick a better example. Like think about
No, Kubrick's
okay, think
actually a
about
really, really good example. I think that's for people who are movie heads like me. I think Kubrick's fantastic. Like there is something I would argue Shakespearean about like some of his peaks.
yeah, like is 2001 a, you know, is that leftist propaganda? You know, you're going to have an uphill battle with that one. You know, I mean, but even like pop. Okay, think about the Beatles. The Beatles, who are like, you know, you would peg them on the left without a second thought. Oh, that's a leftist project. Okay, but if you go back and listen to early Beatles records, you know, the stuff that was like hugely popular in England, it's pretty traditional in its gender roles
So
and
I
in
want to
its,
hold your hand.
you know, it's basically like all the, it's like, you know, you know, I don't know, I can't give a good example, but go listen to that stuff, you know, and tell me that's not trad. You know, it's just basic, sane, normal life, and it speaks to life in a deep enough level with a sense of joy and a sense of intelligence and a sense of, you know, all the positive things in life that make people want to listen to it. Like there's nothing wrong with that. We need that stuff. We need just basic, sane, you know, spirited uh things that just speak to normalcy and life at a deep level to help people come out of the fog of insanity in our culture created by people like Taylor Swift.
Yeah, and also when you do this, when you create this art, I think you do understand it better. And this is something I was talking about a long time ago where we talk about these values that we have, but if you don't understand those values or why they're important or why those specific values are important, they can be inverted. For example,
Mm-hmm.
let's take a funny example. Let's take the virtue of strength, right?
Okay.
Everyone would agree that everyone likes strength. Who doesn't like strength? Well, some people, but most people like strength. But unless you understand a very specific type of strength, strength could be martial prowess, or strength, air quotes, can also be the strength of a man watching his wife get fucked by another man. In a
Right.
way, that's strength. That's a very much an inverted version of strength. But unless you can delineate between different types of strength, you're going to get people who can corrupt it very, very easily. So
Yeah.
you need to have a more visceral understanding of your values, and they can't be
Mm.
vague. They
Yeah.
need that humanity to them rather than just it's poetry without being poetry. We're not writing poetry, we're just writing things that rhyme, it feels like
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, I think what we need is something like sanity. Like if I had to put it in a word, just we need to like the cutting edge of sanity, which just means, you know, well, like you in your example, you know, basic sanity would know the difference between you know, a kind of evil kind of strength and a good kind of strength. Uh, but I think it's very difficult for people in our world, caught up as we are in all this, in all the politics, to get to that kind of basic sanity, because basic sanity also includes things like, you know, uh, emotion and I don't know, aspects of the human condition that it's, you know, like caring about people, where we have a tendency to be so, we get so hard edged in our world. It's like, well, you know, I'm not going to write about caring about people. That's gay, you know. Compassion, that's gay, you know, like that, just that kind of like childishness, where, you know, a real sane grip on life and humanity is what we need. Whereas we tend to have this kind of lust for violence and this kind of weird, hard, uh, you know, I don't know, like overly I hate to say this, but overly masculine uh, compensation for the feminization of our culture. But it's like, well, basic sanity means like, incorporating, there is like a feminine aspect of human life that is a, part of the proper, life of the species, like, and this is what, and people will come down to me for this because I'll tell people like, the right is too hard on women. It's like, you can't just throw away women and just trash women. Like they're half of the equation. You're never going to speak to humanity as a whole and speak to the culture as a whole if you don't find some kind of sane way to balance the role of men and women and the relationship of the masculine and the feminine.
Yeah, one thing I always caution people of, I'm like, because hating women can be very, it can be, fun. Hating women can be fun and educational, sure.
Oh, sure.
But, but I'm like, I caution people, I'm like, look, if you hate women all day, don't be surprised when you just end up surrounded by gay guys. I've seen it
Yeah.
happen so often, and they're flummoxed at why this would happen.
Yeah.
Fuck, I was going to say something, but I told you had a good point there, and then I got waylaid by my idiot joke there. What were you talking about before the women thing?
Art, culture.
It's so hard when someone asks you to like do that.
I
Oh
know.
yeah, you had a good point.
Yeah.
Name 5.
I don't know.
No, but I will just say I agreed with everything you were saying as you're saying. I just got I got distracted by my own stupid thought there. I know we have to get going soon. You're probably very tired. I'm getting tired as well.
Some of us have to work in the morning.
Yeah. So, hey, guess we don't work in Canada. There.
What time is it where you are?
It's 10:02 right now.
Oh, so we're on the same. Okay.
Yeah. I just wanted to say before we get going, we can wrap up soon. I just wanted to say before we get going that I've had a fantastic time talking to you.
Oh yeah, it's been great, man.
And I think we agree on quite a lot of things. I think that when I look at, some people get defeatist or fatalist when they look, they survey the scene, but I get very optimistic. I see that there's a lot of work ahead. There's a lot of, a lot. Oh, you know what I was going to say? I think I remember now. Okay, just to your point about men.
Yeah.
One thing I was doing, I was reading about the American Revolution. I was reading this book called The True History of the American Revolution. It's very interesting.
Oh, I know it.
Yeah, and it was describing sort of the scrappiness of the Minutemen, and describe the images that we are probably used to portray the revolutionaries and their perfect outfits and the uniforms. And he's like, most of the time it was something that their wife had made them before they went out. They provided their own everything. And there was this one line there. It's like, and the rifles that the riflemen had were usually taken down from the pegs above their fireplace, from their mantle. So they just brought their own guns to go to the fucking war, which is such a mind-blowing thing for people to think. But yeah, that's what you did. And that's what you did throughout time, is that, but the idea of sort of the martial man who was ready for war and who was a tough guy, and by all counts, by all estimates, would be the guy that we look up to as the badass. It's like, yeah, he was ready for war, but he wasn't always in war mode, which is something that we kind of get wrapped up in. Like, we always think we got to be in war mode, but the thing about being a tough guy is you don't need to act like a tough guy if you are one. Just like power doesn't behave a certain way. Power behaves however the fuck power wants to behave. So if you are ready for action, point being that, real life killers and real life badasses, they can also love their kids, want to raise their sons. Right. And I always joke that all the biggest mafia badasses, they all listen to fucking Frankie Valli and Frank Sinatra and shit. They didn't need to listen to songs about being a mobster. Maybe a bad example because they watch movies about being gangsters. But the point being that we have this conceptualization of what it takes to be maybe a man, because so many people aren't actually living those principles. And you'll find that once you have a family, once you have a wife, once you have kids, once you actually maybe start going to the gun range and learning to shoot, you'll stop acting like a spurg all the time. And you might be able to embrace these more positive things. And you won't end up like, for example, maybe I shouldn't say this, but my grandfather, he was sort of one of these boomer guys. and he had a lot of these conceptualizations of what a man should be. But that also meant like he didn't cook, the wife cooked, which is whatever. But it's also like by the time he died, it's like you got no skills. Like he doesn't do anything. He's just a kind of a boring loser guy. And no one likes him because he was just, I gotta be mean and cold. And it's not like he fought in fucking Vietnam. I know he didn't. So he couldn't fall back on like the PTSD thing. He was just kind of like just a guy who thought you're not supposed to do that. But then you just die kind of lame, and no one really has good memories about you. But if you are just a badass, you won't need to worry about being a badass and fucking up your life.
Well, as a married man with 3 kids, I completely agree. And I think I get it, because we're trying to correct an extreme over feminization of our culture. So I understand the impulse to like be really exclusively focused on badassery. So I don't want to like come down on people for that, but yeah, like that's half the equation, like you're only going to be so much of a man if you're not also able to like have a familial side, a more softer side, if you're not able to, I don't know, appreciate fine poetry and, whatever. But
yeah, you could be a warrior poet. We used to have those.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm going to let you go. Sorry, I went off on a little tangent there.
But, no, you're good. And let me just say because you were talking about optimism, and I just want to say, I think coming out of a progressive mentality and going through my years, in this dissonant world on the right, my thing is that I'm still, I'm about the future, and I'm about optimism and hope. And so I do think, I think the left kind of, in a sense, they kind of claimed that, in our generation. So we have a tendency to want to be real hard, to be completely in denial of anything like progress, to want to go back to the past, to be super black pilled. And I think that's will be our downfall if we can't get out of that. I think we need to reclaim hope, optimism, art, love, beauty, poetry. We have to reclaim these things for ourselves, and not just think, oh, that's leftism. That's like gay, fake leftism. It's like, no, we need to reclaim those things, ground them in the proper reality and emotions of, manhood and tradition. And then, think forward and actually create some culture that's worthwhile.
I agree completely. And just to remind people that's Anglo Ortho look him up on YouTube.
Also, check out my music page. I've been putting up stuff almost daily at this point. And that's at Ashley, ASHLEY _ Hopkins, HOPKINS.
Get some of that, far right schizo guitar content.
Yes.
And again,
Radiohead covers.
I was going to say, got my seal of approval. And on a deep cut as well, airbag. That's not the one people would pick. So that extra appreciation. All right. This has been a fantastic talk. I had a great time talking to you.
Yeah, man. Thank you for having me.
And I'll hope to talk to you soon.
All right. Definitely.
Bye.
All right. Bye.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.